Imagine for a second that you live down the street from this massive, really historic house.
Okay.
And every time you walk by it, you see this freshly painted exterior, perfectly manicured lawns, solid brickwork. I mean, it looks like it has totally stood the test of time.
Right. It looks great from the sidewalk.
Exactly. But what you don't see, what the neighborhood association literally won't let you see, is that underground, the foundation is completely rotting away. Like the support beams are crumbling, the pipes are leaking toxic water, and the entire structure is essentially just, one bad storm away from total collapse.
And the really terrifying part is that you and basically everyone else in that neighborhood are legally required to rely on that house for your safety. I mean, you don't have the option to just move away from it.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it, because that structure we're talking about today, that's the criminal justice system in New York. You trust it to keep society safe. You trust it to operate fairly. And you trust that the people running it are actually playing by the rules.
Which, as we're going to see, is a pretty big assumption.
Right. So today's deep dive is really going to look past that freshly painted exterior and honestly take a flashlight down into the basement. We are digging into this massive, heavily researched book. It's called The Blue Wall of Silence: How Extremists Infiltrated New York's Justice System and Why No One Stopped Them.
Yeah, it's a really intense read.
It really is. It's a frontline account written by Dr. Michael G. Bomar, published by Bomar Books.
And we should probably mention, Dr. Bomar actually has firsthand experience here. I mean, he literally stood watching the corridors of a northern New York correctional facility, so he saw what the public never, ever does.
Yeah, he was right there in it. And the mission for this deep dive today is to unpack his account of this systemic failure. We're moving way past that really comfortable, isolated bad apples theory to understand how secrecy, economics, and ideology have actually corrupted the machinery of justice from the inside out. But before we get into the actual mechanisms of that corruption, we kind of need to understand why this was hidden for so long. Like, how did nobody know? The book talks a lot about this state secrecy law called Section 50A. Can you explain how that actually worked in practice?
Yeah, so Section 50A, it was basically a cornerstone of the civil rights law in New York for decades, and it essentially acted as this impenetrable firewall. It legally classified police and correction officer disciplinary records as strictly confidential personnel records.
So wait, if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, well, if an officer has a massive history of violence, surely that comes up in court, you would just be completely wrong.
Oh, completely wrong. Yeah. Under 50A, I mean, if an officer beat an incarcerated person or just completely falsified a report, a defense attorney could not bring that history up to a jury.
Yeah.
It was entirely shielded behind an HR wall. We were just legally blind to the rotting foundation, going back to your analogy. But, that law was finally repealed in 2020. And what has emerged in the data since then, it just reveals a system that is fundamentally unmoored from its stated purpose.
So let's start where the foundation is visibly caving in right now, which is inside the prisons themselves. If we want to really understand this crisis, we have to look at the immediate physical reality of the correctional workforce today. Like, what does the staffing actually look like on the ground right now?
To understand the sheer scale of the crisis, I mean, you really just have to look at the manpower numbers that Dr. Bomar provides in the book. In 2019, New York State had roughly 19,000 correction officers. Yeah. By the end of 2025, that number had plummeted to just over 11,000.
Wait, 11,000? So they lost, what, like 40% of their workforce in just over 5 years?
Yeah, a 40% drop.
How is this system even physically functioning with that kind of a massive drop?
Honestly, barely. And it's creating this highly dangerous, pressurized feedback loop. I mean, you have a shrinking staff managing the exact same highly complex, often dangerous environments. And this tension actually boiled over pretty dramatically in February of 2025 when literally thousands of officers walked off the job.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was New York's second ever wildcat strike.
I want to pause there for a second just for anyone listening, because a wildcat strike isn't just a normal union protest, right?
Yeah.
It means it's an unofficial strike. It's completely unauthorized by union leadership, and it's usually illegal for public employees.
That's exactly right. It was an act of total desperation from the officers. They were protesting forced overtime, extremely low pay, and these new prison discipline policies. And ultimately, the state cracked down hard. About 2,000 of those officers were fired because of their participation in the strike.
2,000 fired out of a workforce that's already bleeding staff.
Right. But you have to look at the conditions they were protesting because they were, frankly, inhumane. The book highlights this 2024 report by the Correctional Association of New York, showing that at one facility, officers were routinely being forced into 16-hour shifts.
Oh, man.
Yeah, they're averaging 20 hours of mandatory overtime a week, and some are hitting 30 hours.
I mean, think about that for a second. That is literally like being forced to operate heavy machinery while you are completely sleep-deprived, except the machinery is human lives.
Exactly. And the result of that kind of total exhaustion is a massive spike in violence. For the officers, the job has become objectively more dangerous. State data actually shows an 86% rise in assaults on correction staff between 2019 and 2024.
86%.
Yeah. But for the incarcerated population, the consequences of dealing with this understaffed, exhausted, heavily cynical workforce, I mean, they are frequently fatal.
Which brings up a really, really difficult point in the book, the horrific death of Robert Brooks. This was in December 2024 at Marcy Correctional Facility.
Yeah, it was a tragedy that drew international attention, and rightly so. Robert Brooks, an incarcerated man, was beaten to death by correction officers.
It's just awful.
And it was captured on video, and 10 guards were indicted in February 2025. Dr. Bomar makes it very clear in the book that this wasn't just some anomaly. It was the explosive result of a system operating under chronic stress with virtually zero internal guardrails.
But, here's where I kind of want to push back a little on the standard narrative we always hear. When a tragedy like the death of Robert Brooks happens, I feel like the public reflex is to just blame the individual guards, call them monsters and move on.
Right, the bad apple thing.
Exactly. But if the state is the one literally forcing its employees to work 30 hours of overtime in a violently understaffed facility while paying them poorly, isn't the state itself the primary architect of this violence?
That is the exact crucible Dr. Bomar wants the reader to examine. Yes, absolutely. The individual officers holding the batons, they must be held accountable. But the state builds the pressure cooker. And the state has been building these hyper-violent environments for a very, very long time. There's this profound historical echo here that the book uncovers. Like in July 2024, there was a memorial service at the Hudson Correctional Facility.
Oh, right. This part of the book was just haunting. Can you walk us through what they actually found there?
Yeah. So the memorial was for girls and infants buried in unmarked graves right on the prison grounds. Decades ago, this facility was the New York State Training School for Girls.
Okay.
Teenagers were sent there, often for, minor transgressions like truancy, or honestly, because they were victims of abuse themselves with literally nowhere else to go.
Wow.
And some died of disease in custody, some died in childbirth while incarcerated, and they were just buried in these knee-high graves with no names, just numbers on a marker. It really shows a century-long legacy of institutional violence and neglect against the most vulnerable people in the state.
So if you have this baseline of physical crisis, right, and this deep historical legacy of violence, how on earth does the system keep this hidden? I mean, if a normal hospital operated like this, it would be shut down in a week.
Easily. But it survives because the system's primary defense mechanism is secrecy, which is backed up by a deeply ingrained culture of willful blindness. We mentioned the repeal of Section 50A earlier, right?
Yeah.
When journalists finally got their hands on that disciplinary data, the reality of that blue wall of silence became completely undeniable. In 2021, the New York Times analyzed these newly released records. They found that over half of the roughly 270 correction officers disciplined over a 20-month period had simply lied to investigators or filed false reports.
Over half.
Over half.
And let's look at how that actually works mechanically. An officer uses excessive force, and instead of reporting it, they just fabricate the incident report. They claim the incarcerated person fell or attacked first. And because of the blue wall of silence, the other officers on shift will just automatically corroborate the lie.
Exactly.
But this culture of lying isn't new. I mean, the book takes us all the way back to 1894 to something called the Lexo Committee.
Right, which was a massive state Senate investigation into the NYPD.
Yeah, and for anyone listening who doesn't know their 19th century New York history, this is when Tammany Hall basically ran the city. They were this notoriously corrupt political machine. And the Lexow Committee found that the police department was essentially Tammany Hall's armed enforcement wing. Like they were extorting local businesses, protecting illegal gambling rings, literally rigging elections at the ballot box.
And you fast forward nearly 80 years to the 1970s, and you have the Knapp Commission doing the same thing. Dr. Bomar highlights the story of Detective Robert Lucci, who wore a wire to expose that officers were routinely taking bribes and protecting drug dealers.
Right.
And Lucci's career was completely destroyed. He lived under constant threat from his own colleagues just for breaking that code of silence.
So help me connect the dots here, because I'm genuinely confused. If we have been investigating police and guard corruption since 1894 with the Lexow Committee, and it feels like every single generation forms some grand new oversight commission with, a bunch of press conferences, why does the system just keep reverting to its corrupt default? Like, are these commissions just theatrical band-aids?
I mean, that is the tragic reality. The commissions often do excellent, rigorous investigative work.
Sure.
But systemic corruption isn't a math problem you just solve once and move on from. It is a chronic condition. The real issue is that oversight bodies like the Department of Investigation or the commissions formed in the 90s, they often lack actual prosecution power.
Oh, so they just point out the problem.
Exactly. They issue a scathing report. The political pressure eventually dies down. The public looks away, and the system just reestablishes the status quo.
Right.
Because the underlying financial and structural incentives haven't changed one bit.
Right, because if the system is completely opaque and the state isn't actually looking over their shoulder, you've basically just built the perfect consequence-free laboratory for organized crime. I mean, what happens when underpaid guards realize literally no one is watching?
Well, you get a thriving illegal economy, and the book examines this through two lenses, bottom up and top down. So bottom up, you have the story of Gary Hayward. He wrote a memoir called Corruption Officer. And Hayward wasn't some, cartoon villain. He was a decorated Desert Storm veteran who served 10 years at Rikers Island.
Right.
But in 2006, he was convicted for selling drugs throughout the jail.
His descent into corruption is just a masterclass in how environment dictates behavior, I think. He hit severe financial hardship, right? He couldn't pay his bills, and he's walking every single day into an environment where the usual rules of society just don't exist.
Because it's a captive hyper-economy. The mechanics of the smuggling are fascinating and terrifying. The markup on prison contraband is astronomical.
Right. Like a basic throwaway cell phone that might cost you, I don't know, $50 at a gas station is suddenly a luxury asset worth thousands of dollars inside. A tiny amount of narcotics is worth a month's salary.
Exactly.
So if you have an officer struggling to pay their mortgage and they realize they can smuggle a package in their lunch cooler past a lax security checkpoint and make $5,000 in a single day, the temptation becomes almost mathematically inevitable.
And that's the tragedy of the frontline worker. Dr. Bomar forces us to look at the top-down corruption, too, where the stakes are honestly even higher. Look at Bernard Kerik.
Oh, yeah, this was wild.
Yeah, he was the NYPD commissioner, celebrated globally after 9/11. He was even nominated by President George W. Bush in 2004 to be the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Right before investigative reporting brought his whole career crashing down.
Exactly. The investigations exposed him accepting bribes, having ties to organized crime, and he was eventually convicted of tax fraud. But the crucial mechanic here isn't just what Kerik did, it's how the system actively protected him.
Oh, because they knew.
Reports indicated the administration knew about his questionable past, his mob ties, and they pushed him forward anyway. The system will absolutely shield powerful figures if they have political utility.
And that ecosystem of profit hasn't stopped either. The book cites the Dirty 30 NYPD scandal in 2011, which involved massive drug trafficking by officers. Even just recently, in 2023 and 2024, there were state police scandals where officers were literally stealing drugs out of evidence rooms to sell them on the street.
Yeah.
But, as dark as the financial corruption is, this dark room of secrecy isn't just used for profit, it's used for power.
Right. And this is where Dr. Bomar's research moves into crimes of ideology, the actual infiltration of these systems by extremist groups.
And for you listening, I want to be really, really clear on our mission here, okay? We are impartially reporting what is heavily documented in the source material and by federal agencies. We aren't taking political sides here. The book simply lays out a clear historical record of hate groups, including white supremacist organizations like the KKK, actively infiltrating law enforcement.
And we don't have to guess about this either. In 2006, the FBI issued a report explicitly warning that white supremacist groups were infiltrating law enforcement agencies across the country. And then in 2015, the Department of Justice's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services put out a guide acknowledging this exact same threat.
But why? Like, what is the mechanical advantage for an extremist group to infiltrate a local police department?
It's all about access and authority. Extremists join these ranks to intentionally target minority communities for harassment under the color of law. But even more dangerously, they get their hands on highly sensitive law enforcement databases.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, they can run license plates, look up home addresses of political opponents, and just gather intelligence that they then feed back to their extremist networks.
And we are seeing the modern evidence of this right now. The book notes that in 2023, a New York corrections officer was fired for sharing inmate information with a white supremacist group and posting racist content. And then in 2024, a police officer in upstate New York was actually arrested for participating in a hate crime with a white supremacist group.
Yeah, it's happening today.
So I have to ask, we have the FBI sounding the alarm in 2006. We have the DOJ warning us in 2015. How is it that you or I can have our credit score and our internet history thoroughly screened just to get a basic civilian office job, but the mechanisms to screen violent extremists out of the justice system remain this weak?
It really comes down to a profound failure of the vetting process at a structural level. I mean, you have thousands of decentralized police and sheriff's departments, and as we discussed, they are often incredibly desperate for recruits.
Right, the staffing crisis.
Exactly. So the background checks frequently miss encrypted social media chats or underground affiliations because they honestly aren't looking deep enough. And frankly, there has been a historical reluctance within police culture to aggressively police its own members' ideologies. They often hide behind the guise of, off-duty personal freedom right up until the exact moment it manifests as a violent crime.
So if the guards are exhausted or corrupted, and if some police are compromised by extremism, the courts are supposed to be our fail-safe, right? The judiciary is supposed to catch this stuff. It's like the courts are the immune system of society.
In theory, yes. But what Dr. Bomar meticulously outlines is what happens when the immune system starts attacking the body instead.
Yeah, because we see judicial and prosecutorial misconduct in the book that is just staggering.
Right. Take the Buffalo bribery scandal in the 1990s, where state court judges were convicted of taking bribes for favorable rulings. Or just look at the catastrophic prosecutorial overreach in the Central Park 5 case, where innocent Black and Latino teenagers lost years of their lives.
Yeah.
Despite the documented misconduct by prosecutors in cases like that, no one in authority is ever held accountable.
Because they have built legal shields for themselves.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this and thinking, well, if a guard assaulted me or a prosecutor hid evidence, I'd just sue them, you really need to understand the mechanics of qualified immunity.
Yes.
This is a legal doctrine that basically blocks victims from suing government officials unless they can find a nearly identical prior court case saying their exact specific right was violated in that exact way.
Yeah.
It is an impossibly high bar.
It is. And prosecutors have absolute immunity from civil liability for their work in court. Plus, the system utilizes the good faith exception, which literally allows illegally obtained evidence into a trial if the officer just claims they made an honest mistake. The deck is entirely stacked to protect the institution, not the citizen.
So if the legal framework is this entrenched, how do we even begin to change the rules on the ground? And I think this leads directly into the current legislative battleground, which is the HALT Act.
Right. The Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement Act, which was passed in 2021. And we need to look at both sides of this neutrally because it really encapsulates the entire crisis of a broken system trying to regulate itself. The HALT Act legally limits solitary confinement to 15 days. For advocates like Jerome Wright, who personally spent 7 years in solitary, this is a massive human rights victory.
Right, because the data is super clear. Prolonged solitary confinement causes severe psychological damage, hallucinations, suicidal ideation. The Correctional Association found that people with mental illness, and particularly Black incarcerated people, were disproportionately thrown into solitary. Advocates view it as literal psychological torture.
Exactly.
And in October 2025, the HAL Solitary Campaign actually petitioned the United Nations, arguing New York is violating international human rights law by finding loopholes to keep people isolated anyway.
But on the other side of that legislative battle, you have the officers, retired Officer Eric Wing, and legislators like State Senator Joe Griffo. They argue that banning long-term solitary is incredibly dangerous for the staff.
I have to admit, I really struggled with this when reading the book. On one hand, isolating a human being in a box for months is undeniably torture. But if you're a guard and someone just put your coworker in the hospital, and the state says you can't separate that person from the general population. I mean, what are you supposed to do?
Right.
Remember that 86% spike in staff assaults? The guards view the HLT Act as stripping away their only tool to maintain order in a system that is bleeding staff.
And that's the impossible situation Dr. Bomar highlights. You have human rights advocates citing international law, and you have guards saying, look, I just want to survive my shift.
Yeah.
If the foundation is rotting, passing the HLT Act without fixing the staffing crisis is basically just putting a new coat of paint on that rotting house we talked about earlier. I mean, it looks nice to the neighbors, but the floorboards are still caving in. Real reform requires accountability with actual teeth and addressing those root causes.
So what does that actually look like? As we wrap up this deep dive, the book lays out some very specific paths forward. First, real transparency. The New York Civil Liberties Union releasing 2 decades of officer misconduct records in 2025 was a massive step. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Second, we need serious, modernized extremist vetting that the FBI and DOJ have been begging for since 2006. We need to check encrypted chats, not just list references.
And third, the state has to seriously look at decarceration and clemency. The NAACP has been pushing hard for this. Governor Hochul took some steps in 2025, granting clemency to 13 people and creating an advisory panel.
Right.
But there is still over 1,000 petitions pending. When a system physically cannot safely or humanely house people, reducing the population of those who honestly shouldn't be there, like the elderly, or those on outdated sentences, it becomes a matter of basic public safety.
It's about shrinking the footprint of a broken machine. So after unpacking all of this corruption, violence, and ideological hijacking, what does this all mean for us?
You know, I want to leave you with a thought that really crystallizes the stakes here. We spend a lot of time in this book, and honestly just in society, thinking about the bad apples, the corrupt guards, the extremists, and the terrible trauma they inflict on their victims.
Yeah, of course.
But think about the psychological toll on the good apples, the honest officers, the overworked public defenders, the principled judges. They have to wake up and walk into this inherently corrupt ecosystem every single day. If the system demands complicity just to survive, what does it do to the soul of the person who tries to remain good? And how much longer can society rely on their silent endurance?
Wow, that is a heavy, essential question. Because if all the good people are driven out by the pressure, we are only left with the rot. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the blue wall of silence, looking critically at the systems around you. Keep asking questions about how things actually work. And next time you walk past that beautiful historic house, remember to ask yourself what is happening in the foundation.